On our program, The Secret History of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, you stated that neither were black, yet the Queen of Sheba herself was from Ethiopia. How can an Ethiopian not be black? The audience wants to know.
Ethiopia does not mean Ethiopia. It never has until very recently. So if you look through Greek records, if you look through the Kebra Nagast, even within the biblical texts, 99% of the time, if they're talking about Ethiopia, they're talking about Upper Egypt. And we know this because Strabo says that Ethiopia went as far as Aswan. So as far south from Egypt as Aswan. So Ethiopia encompassed Upper Egypt, not Ethiopia as we know it at present. Same for the Kebra Nagast, which is the Ethiopian Bible. The Ethiopian Bible says that Ethiopia's borders went up to the Dead Sea. And of course, never in history has modern Ethiopia ever had borders that terminated on the Dead Sea. It's talking about Egypt. And we also know this from the Queen of Sheba herself, because she was Egyptian. She was not Ethiopian. If you read the Kebra Nagast, and again I like these links because you can only see them if you have the Kebra Nagast opened in conjunction with the same texts in the Old Testament. So nobody would have known about this until 1890, I think it was, when the Kebra Nagast was first discovered and translated. Well, actually, it was translated back in the 15th century in Spain, but it was lost again, and nobody knew anything about it until it was rediscovered by the British explorers in the 19th century, and it was translated into English for the first time in about 1890. So nobody could have understood this until that translation. But if you get them side by side, you suddenly find that we have this mysterious princess who married King David, which is very strange because Egyptian princesses were never supposed to marry outside Egypt, which is a good indication, of course, that King David was probably Egyptian. But there we go. So this daughter of the Pharaoh married King David. And it's not until you go and compare with what it says in the Kebra Nagast that you suddenly find out that this daughter of the Pharaoh that married King David was actually the Queen of Sheba. And so now we can tie this into a big firm knot with a nice bow. And we can say quite surely, quite securely, positively, that the daughter of the Pharaoh that's mentioned in the Old Testament is actually the Queen of Sheba. And we also have this from the other direction because I was calculating who King David was. And King David, it turns out, if you look into the Egyptian record, because he was an Egyptian pharaoh, as we discussed before, and his name, his short names, were either King Duad, which is where we get David from, or King Sheba, because his name was also Pasiba Kahayanit, Pashiba. So his name could be shortened down to King Sheba. And he had a daughter. And it just so happens that, if you look through the biblical text, his daughter was called Bathsheba, which means daughter of Sheba, because his name was Sheba. But King David actually married Bathsheba, and this is part of the reason they've been meddling with some of these texts and changing the names a little bit, because what they didn't want you to know is that Bathsheba was King David's daughter. They didn't want you to know that he had just married his daughter. But that was the Egyptian tradition. That's what they all did. That's what all of the pharaohs did. That's what Akhenaten did. That's what Cleopatra did. She married her brothers. That's what King Agrippa did. He married his sister. That's what Simon Magus did, and Queen Theomusa Orania. And all of these other people, they were all marrying within the family. Even Abraham married his sister. So this was quite normal, but they wanted to cover it up. So they didn't want you to know that Bathsheba was the daughter of King David, the daughter of King Sheba. But of course, when she married her father, she gained a new title because she was now a queen. So Bathsheba became Malka-Sheba. The daughter of Sheba became the queen of Sheba because she had married her father. She was now the queen. She was the queen of Sheba because she was married to Sheba, King Sheba. So if you look at it again from that point of view, which is completely separate to what we looked at before, we suddenly find again that the queen of Sheba was Egyptian because King David was a pharaoh of the 21st dynasty called Bathsheba Kahanet. So all of this story again is revolving around Egypt, like everything has before we've looked at. Even when we looked at Jesus and his links, his family links directly back to Egypt again. They were all a part of this Egyptian monarchy that flowed out, through to Ireland and Scotland, and also flowed up through France and into Holland, and also flowed up through into Judea and to the Judaic monarchy.
The Bible says God made Solomon be black because he disobeyed God. And there are people on the forums here that are saying that is the white man trying to disrespect blacks or minimize them or say that anyone that was black was actually made black only by God as a curse.
Yeah, but I think that's a complete misinterpretation because it doesn't actually say that. If someone says that the Torah says that, they'll have to quote precisely because it doesn't say that. What it does say, and I think what they're trying to quote here, is the Song of Songs, which is not in all Bibles. It's normally one of the Apocrypha. It's one of the separate chapters that's not included in all Bibles. But I think this comes from the Song of Songs. And the person saying this is actually the Queen of Sheba, not King Solomon. She is black, but she is beautiful. So yeah, as far as I know, that is a quote from the Queen of Sheba. But of course, the Queen of Sheba was an Egyptian queen, and the reason why it's saying she was black is because she was Cam. She was Egyptian. Cam means Egyptian. It means black as well, but it means Egyptian. That's why, as I said before, King Abgarus of Edessa, who was the father of Jesus, was also called Cam, not because he was black, because he was Egyptian. And again, we know that because if you go about 3 or 4 generations further on from King Abgarus, the next Abgarus is called Abgarus the Red, because he was ginger. They were ginger-haired. So again, yes, I think people are misreading the text to suit their agenda, basically.
Another one says, white people had absolutely nothing to do with ancient African culture as much as they'd like to believe they did. The only characters they represent in the Bible are Esau and the Edomites.
Yeah, well, that might be true of African culture, but of course the Egyptians were not African. They were a totally separate race to anything in Africa. That's what I was trying to say before, where sub-Saharan Africa is almost a completely different continent to the rest of Africa. And North Africa has had nothing to do with the sort of sub-Saharan black Negro type for thousands of years. I mean, if you look into northern Africa, northern Africa was first settled really by the Phoenicians, who are very sort of pale-skinned people, the people who live in Lebanon now. If you go to Beirut, a lot of the original Phoenicians are still there, and they claim a Phoenician ancestry, which I think has almost been proven by genetics as well. And they are normal sort of Near Eastern European types. It was then settled by the Romans, of course, when after Hannibal. So there was a lot of Roman influence. And then there was a lot of Germanic influence because they had I think it was the Alans, and they had the Goths, the Visigoths, two of the tribes who invaded Rome at the end of the Western Roman Empire. This would have been about the 5th century AD. They pushed into Rome, they took over various sections of Rome, and then they went down to southern France, and they went into Spain. And then they decided to go to North Africa. I'm not sure why they decided to go to North Africa, but they resettled North Africa. And this is an awful lot of people. I mean, we're talking maybe a couple of 100,000 people just charged into North Africa and took over the whole of the region. And they were Germanic. They weren't anything to do with Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. And even before that time, in the 13th century BC, if you look at images that the Egyptians made of, they called them the Libyans, the North Africans. They were a very white-skinned people at that time, which would have even been, no, it would have been about the same time as the Phoenicians, and they were a very white-skinned people according to the Egyptians. So yeah, I can't agree with any of what was being said there. Northern Africa was a completely different continent to sub-Saharan Africa, and the people there were nothing to do with sub-Saharan Africa. And in modern genetics, they've been showing this. They haven't done quite enough work on this as yet, but they did a comparison with Tutankhamun on his mummy, and they found that the closest phenotypes, the closest genotypes to Tutankhamun were Western European males. So again, we're not talking anything to do with Africa.
Is it your intention to minimize the historical accomplishments of blacks? Are you in any way motivated politically or otherwise? Well,
no, I never even thought about this until people started getting very angry on the internet and so on, and in emails, as they often do. This is just an investigation into history. It has nothing to do with colour or race. There are races involved, but you just follow the truth, and the truth just is. The truth can't be racist or have any isms. The truth is just the truth, and how you deal with it is your problem, basically. But the truth is that, you know, these peoples of Egypt and the peoples of the Near East have nothing to do with Southern Africa whatsoever. It's sad that they want to take over a history and try and make it their own, which is very sad that they would want to do that. But that's their problem, not my problem.